Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and I'd like to welcome you to the Pauline Epistles. For this class, we're going to be using as our companion textbook Longnecker's and Still's book, Thinking Through Paul, A Survey of His Life, Letters, and Theology. I'm not going to be reading through this book for you, but it does serve as a companion piece. So I do urge you to buy it and read along there. I will follow the same general outline of the book. So that the first couple of classes, so I'm organizing this into weeks, even though I might actually separate a few of the internet, I'm sorry, some of the lectures into several ones per week. But introduction, right now we're just introducing the topic, and then we'll be looking next time at Paul's story and his travels. Weeks 3 and 4 are the early years. Those are the Thessalonian epistles and the epistle to the Galatians. Weeks 5 through 8 are what we call the middle years. These are the Corinthian epistles and also the book of Romans. Weeks 9 through 11, notice the prison epistles. In that, we're including both Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, but also Philemon, since it's written about that same time. And then finally, the pastoral epistles. These are the last epistles that Paul writes. And then the last few weeks, we're going to be looking in reflection at Paul's theological legacy. That's the outline that the textbook uses. I'm going to follow the same general outline. Now, let's look at the world in which Paul lived. When we look at the world in the close of the Old Testament, and then we turn the page to the New Testament as the New Testament opens, there's a big difference. What is that difference? Well, first of all, there are different world rulers. At the end of the Old Testament, we have the Persians. They are the sort of big rulers on the scene. As we turn the page and find ourselves in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the Romans are in charge. Persians, or actually the ruler of the Persian Empire by now, are the Parthians. We hardly read of them. They're in the distance. They're not coming onto our story much at all. They're speaking Greek instead of Hebrew or Aramaic. And so that the Greek language has become the common language of the day, even though there are people that are going to continue speaking Hebrew and Aramaic, especially around Jerusalem and the Middle East. But as our story moves to the West, and all of the books of the New Testament that we have are all written in Greek. There's a tradition that says Matthew wrote his gospel account first in Hebrew, and then it was later translated into Greek. That may be true, but we don't have it in Hebrew. People have tried to take the Greek that we have and translate it back into Hebrew, but that's a little problematic. Also, the culture that we have has changed considerably. Instead of that Persian Middle Eastern culture, there's still that Middle Eastern underlay, but now we have both Greek and Roman culture that have sort of come on the scene and will be impacting our view. Although remember that the Jewish people, the Hebrews, are still Hebrews. They still have their very distinctive Hebrew ideas, but now in the background are both Greek and Roman ideas. Now, how did that all come about? 400 BC, that's around the time the Old Testament is completed. Book of Malachi, around that time. Notice I put a question mark. We don't know exactly. When we get to the 300s, notice I have 331 BC. Alexander the Great conquers the Persian Empire. And so the Persian Empire comes to an end, actually does come to an end there. Later on, there'll be a resurgence because there's still people living in Persia. That'll be the Parthians, but that comes quite a bit later. Alexander himself had set out in the space of 10 years, had marched through the Persian Empire all the way, and actually had entered India and had fought some battles in India and had been victorious. At the end of that time, he returned back to Babylon, where he became very sick, and as he lay on his deathbed, only 33 years old, his generals gathered around him and asked, "To whom are you going to give your kingdom?" And he whispered out, "To the strongest." As a result, his kingdom broke up. We're not going to look at that whole breakup, but the two families that are of special interest to us are the Ptolemies, who who took control of Egypt, the Ptolemy the first, and then each one of his sons are Ptolemy the second, third, fourth, all the way down to Ptolemy the 12th, after whom comes Cleopatra of Roman fame. But again, that's beyond the scope of what we're going to look at. And notice to the north of them, you have, of course, Judah had returned from its Babylonian captivity in the days of the Persians. And then the Seleucids, notice, that now the Ptolemies were Greek, ruling Egypt. The Seleucids were Greek, ruling Mesopotamia, and initially lands all the way, again, all the way to the borders of India, although they're gradually going to lose those possessions far in the east. But they'll continue to be here for at least a time. And one of the Seleucids, who really plays a big part in the history of Judah, is Antiochus Epiphanes. He's also known as Antiochus IV, and he meddles in the politics of the kingdom of Judah, and at one point actually enters into the temple and orders a statue of Zeus placed in the temple. He decides those Jewish people, I don't really like their religion. They're a little too troublesome, and maybe they would be a little bit more tamer if we could make them sort of theologically neutered, or what he's going to do is try to impose Greek religion upon them and do away with their Hebrew religion. It doesn't work. They rebel against that. There is a group known as the Maccabees. Let's look at our timeline again. The Hasmonean kings, and initially this is this rebellious group, the Maccabees. They are led by a priestly family, but eventually they actually get their independence back, and they take the land of Judah and they rule over it, and eventually take for themselves the title of kings. And for a brief period there, Judah is an independent country again. And they had been under Persia, and then they had been under these various Greek kings, first the Ptolemies and then the Seleucids, and they sort of went back and forth between the two. But now for a short time, they are independent until the coming of Rome. Pompey the Great is a Roman general who had been commissioned by Rome, by the Senate and the people of Rome, to clear the seas of piracy, and he accomplished that. But they had given him sort of a blank check of authority for about 5 years. He cleared the seas of piracy in the first year. But then after that, he continued on to the east. He conquered Syria, and he also conquered Jerusalem, and took Jerusalem and Little Judah, changed their name to Judea, and made them a Roman province. And so now Judah becomes Judea, just a different pronunciation of the same place. As we look at a map of the area, notice Judea in the south, and then moving forward, you had Samaria and Galilee. Galilee is the area around the Sea of Galilee. And then to the east of the Jordan River, notice Perea in the south, and then the Decapolis. The word Decapolis meant the 10 cities. One of those cities was Damascus, but these are 10 Gentile cities. This was an area that had been settled by Gentiles. Might have been a few Jewish people there, but mostly Gentile people. And then the capital of this area was not Jerusalem. Actually, the capital was eventually going to become Caesarea, a city that was built there on the ocean. Now, when Pompey had first conquered it, he placed Judea under a procurator by the name of Antipater. Antipater was a procurator, but then he placed his own sons as governors of the area, Faisal in Judea, and a young fellow named Herod, who's going to be Herod the Great, and it will be his family that holds dominion. So I notice I've referenced the Herodian family. Herod eventually will be given the title of King of the Jews, starting in 40 BC. Actually, he'll be given that title. He'll actually be driven out of the area, but he'll come back with the Romans, and they will place him on the throne, and they will make him king over the entire area, king of the Jews, not Damascus, but all the rest of these provinces. And then after his death, that will go to his son Archelaus, and actually Antipas will get a little portion too. But Judea will then be ruled by procurators for a time, a whole series of Roman procurators, Roman officials. Their job is going to be to procure the taxes, hence the title procurator, to procure the taxes for Rome, because what Rome really wanted was the money. As long as everything was peaceful and the conquered peoples were paying taxes, they were pretty much free to do their own thing. They had freedom of religion, and as long as everything was at peace. Now, Judaism in the days of Paul, and we're coming up now to the days of Paul, even though Paul wasn't born here, he does, the first time we see him is going to be at Jerusalem. You had several different sects. The Pharisees were one of those sects. The word Pharisee actually means the ones who have separated themselves. And those were the ones who looked at the scriptures and tried to live by the scriptures. And when I say the scriptures, what we call the Old Testament, the books that our Jewish friends call the Tanakh, stands for the Torah, that is the law, the Naviim, the prophets, and the Ketuvim, the writings. And those are the books, the 39 books that we think of as the Old Testament. The Jewish people count them different, depending on who you speak to. It's either 22 or 24 books, but it's the same books. Sometimes they count them a little bit different, like the minor prophets, they count as one book. So you had the Pharisees. There were also the Sadducees. Now, this was the group that tended to have the most influence in the temple. And the Sadducees, they viewed themselves, I'm not sure if they really were, but they viewed themselves as the ultra-Orthodox, because instead of looking at the entire Tanakh, they said just the law of Moses. Those are the books, those are the important books for us. The others might be nice books, but the ones that we see of supreme authority are the books of Moses, Genesis through Deuteronomy. And as a result, there's not a lot mentioned in the Torah about things like resurrection and life after death, and so they actually rejected those ideas, along with angels. I'm not sure how they got that, because angels are found in Genesis and some of the books of the law, but they rejected almost the supernatural element, although they believed in God. And like I said, they were especially influential in the temple, whereas the Pharisees probably had greater influence in the synagogues. We're going to talk about the difference between those two establishments in just a bit. There was also a very small group known as the Essenes. In fact, all of these groups were relatively small. Most people didn't fit into any one of these. The Essenes were a separatist group that we know about. One group of the Essenes that had a settlement by the Dead Sea at a place we call Qumran. That's the place where we found the Dead Sea Scrolls. There were other groups of Essenes living in other locations, but they were a very small splinter group. When I said the Pharisees were separatists, the Essenes were ultra-separatists. They actually separated from the temple, and they wouldn't go to the temple. They thought the temple had been corrupted, and that the rest of Judaism had been corrupted. And so they sort of got out of town and got to their own little communal areas and stayed there. And then finally, the final group were the Zealots. They were really interested in politics, and politics that had no Rome in them. So they wanted to get rid of the Roman Empire, and they wanted Israel to be free. And I think everybody in all of these groups would have said, well, that would be a nice thing, but the Zealots were ready to fight and die for it. So that's what, they were very zealous for the freedom of the land. Now, the first century world, then, we've been talking mostly about the Jewish world, but notice we have both Rome and Greek influences, and these different idea groups, the Greeks, the Romans, and sometimes we talk about the Greco-Roman Empire, and that's okay to refer to it, but those are distinct cultures, so that Roman ideas and Greek ideas were not the same thing. They might have looked similar to an outsider. As we look at them, sometimes we can say, well, gee, they rather look alike, but to an insider, they were very different. The Romans looked at the Greeks as sort of flighty, and the Greeks looked at the Romans as sort of stuffy and overbearing, and the Jews looked at both of them as outsiders, and vice versa. So three distinct cultural groups that lived next to each other, but not a lot of intermixing. It reminds me of the culture down where I live in South Florida, where, people have looked at it and referred to it as sort of a melting pot. And I say, well, no, it's really sort of a salad bowl. You have these different cultures, but they still keep their distinctions. So that, for example, my mother was born and raised in Puerto Rico. And so there's that Latin culture with which I'm familiar, but also there's the American side and Cuban and Brazilian and all sorts of different areas with their very distinct flavors. And that was true of the first century world as well. Now, I mentioned temple and synagogue. There was only one temple. That was there was, I should say there was only supposed to be one Jewish temple. Now, there were pagan temples. I'm not talking about those. And we've actually found evidence that there had been much earlier one or two other Jewish temples built in other places, but they weren't really considered sanctioned. They weren't considered to be good things. They were sort of I almost want to think renegade. There was only supposed to be one true temple, but there were many synagogues. The idea of the synagogue began with the Babylonian captivity when they didn't have a temple to worship. Where are we going to worship? Maybe we'll just have a coming together place where we get together, we'll read the scriptures, we'll pray, we'll sing. Maybe we'll have a word of exhortation. And the word for coming together place that you take the suna is coming together, and agoge is like a meeting place. And so that's the word synagogue. It's a coming together meeting place. And there were many synagogues, both in Israel, but also in other parts of the Roman, and not just within Rome, in other locations too. In the east, in Mesopotamia, we have evidence of synagogues. And so the Jewish people, wherever they spread out, sort of the typical Jewish rule is if you had 10 free Jewish men, that was enough to have a synagogue. And so some synagogues were very big. We're looking at the ruins of a synagogue in Capernaum down below. But we've found synagogues all over the Roman and non-Roman world. Now, the first century synagogue practices, and I'm standing here in a reproduction of a synagogue. Actually, this one's in Nazareth, in Israel. Like I said, you had to have 10 Jewish men, 10 free men. They would meet on the Sabbath, and the times varied. Sometimes they would meet, because the Jewish Sabbath actually begins Friday evening at sundown. But they're going to read the scriptures, and you might not be able to do that so well. Remember, they didn't have electric lights, so if they don't have any lighting, how are you going to do that? So they would usually wait until the next day, either the morning or sometime during the Sabbath. The times varied. There would be men and women present, and they would have a reading of the scriptures. They would actually keep the scriptures in an aron. That's actually the Hebrew word today for a closet, like a box. And they would, the Ark of the Covenant was referred to as an aron. So you could call that an ark, a closet, a holding place. And they would bring the scriptures out, and they would open them up, a scroll that they would have, and they would read from the scriptures. Now, that tells me that among those 10 men, or among the synagogue, there were those people that could read. You see, literacy, and we're going to talk about that in a bit, literacy was a thing, especially among the Jewish people, who were people of the book. And so only men were permitted to read aloud. You say, well, does that mean there were women that could read? I believe that there were. Now, they might not have read as much or aloud as the men did, but I think there's some evidence that there were Jewish women that could read. Only men were permitted to read aloud, and then there would be a period of questions and answers. And finally, there would be perhaps a word of exhortation. Now, look at the primary languages here that are mentioned. You have Latin in the West, and of course, that's where Rome is, and also North Africa. Latin would be spoken in those areas. The area which in the past had been the location for Carthage, that had been destroyed by the Romans, but now by this time it had been rebuilt by Romans, been made into a Roman colony. That's in North Africa. And then as you move toward the east, Greek becomes the primary language, even though Latin might be, remember they were under Rome, so Latin might be considered official, but educated people spoke Greek as well as Latin. Greek had been sort of the bridge between the East and the West, and so both in Greece you would expect to, but also as you move into what the Greeks called Anatolia, what we call modern Turkey today. But then notice far to the east in the Levant, in the area around Israel and Damascus, you have Aramaic, and of course, Aramaic is the language of Aram. Aram is the people living there. The land of Aram had its capital as Damascus. Damascus was no longer a ruling city; it was an important city, but no longer a place of rulership. There were other places where you had the Roman governors, but the language had continued to be a a very common language, and still it could be spoken in both Israel and other locations. Aramaic and Hebrew are not the same, but they're very similar. A little like when you go to Spain and Portugal, and the languages Portuguese and Spanish are similar, but they are actually different. Sometimes if you know one, you're going to hear a lot of common words in the other. And Aramaic and Hebrew are like that, but they're still two different languages. Now, I want to talk a bit about the writing materials that were used. We have monumental inscriptions, especially in the Greek language. In fact, we found those Greek monuments and Greek inscriptions, not only in Greece, but all throughout Anatolia, and even in the Levant. We've even found them in Israel, because Greek was a universal language. And so we find Greek in these inscriptions, and the fact that they're writing on their walls means that there are people that can read that. Not everybody could, but that some could. Next we have ostraca. Now, an ostraca is a piece of usually some sort of broken ceramic, like a broken pottery, and this would be taken and people would write on it. And we would think of it as scrap paper, because paper hadn't been invented yet, and other writing materials could be quite expensive. And so this was a cheap form for writing material. And we found not just little scribbles, but we've actually found legal documents written on ostraca, written on broken pieces of pottery, documents like a bill of divorce, or other agreements that were written on these broken bits of pottery. Next, we have papyrus. Now, papyrus is formed by a papyrus plant that only grows in Egypt, and you take it and you cut it into strips, and then you lay it in sort of a checkerboard fashion, and you pound it all together. It turns into sort of a mush, and you set it out in the sun to dry for a few days. That's to get one page. So you have to repeat that for every page that you use. And it is a form on which you can write, and it became very popular. You can not only write on it, but you can bind it on one end. We'll talk about that in a moment. And some of our earliest copies, or portions of copies, of the New Testament are on papyri. So this was a form that had become very popular, relatively inexpensive, even though it takes a bit of labor. But if you're willing to do that, you can make a papyri page, and then of course you want to trim it nice and smooth on the sides and at the top and bottom. But now you can write on it. And that will be good, except just like paper, it can be damaged by the elements. So papyri works best when it is in a dry climate. For example, we have found papyri in some of the Dead Sea Scrolls. Not all, most of them weren't. Most of them were a different form. We'll talk about that in a moment. But we have found papyri, and they survive because the Dead Sea area is a very dry area. It doesn't rain very often, and they had been placed in caves and protected. Likewise, in Egypt, we've found papyri because Egypt's a very, very dry climate. Hardly ever rains there. And so dry climate means that you can use papyri. Parchment, on the other hand, is composed of animal skin, where you take an animal and of course, you have to kill it and then skin it. And then one side of the animal can be used for one page, and the other side can be used for the other page. That means that 2 pages equals one animal. That can get rather expensive. And You'll scrape off the hide. You have to treat it in a certain way. I'm not sure all the details there, but scriptures were normally the Old Testament scriptures were normally kept on parchment, and so that most of the Dead Sea Scrolls that we have are by means of parchment, especially like the longer Isaiah scroll. Some of the larger scrolls, these are on parchment, animal skins, quite expensive, and yet also quite durable. Now, I mentioned the codex just a minute ago. This is the idea of taking your pages, and instead of sewing them together to make one long scroll, of only binding each page on the side to make what we think of as a book with a binding on one side. Um, the earliest codex that we have goes to probably about the first century. It was a means that seemed to be a little bit slow in its growth of popularity. As far as I can tell, the people who first liked the Codex, who were really caught on, was among the Christians. So that our earliest copies of the New Testament, I already mentioned, were on papyri, but specifically were on papyri that seem to have been placed in a codex. And the reason we know that is because we found a page, it's not in great shape, but a portion of a page, and it's front and back. And if it was a scroll, you'd have to go all the way to the end. Even if it's a scroll, you don't usually write a scroll on both sides, but you'd have to go all the way to the end and then flip it over. But this, you could tell from it's a portion of the Gospel of John. You could tell that this is on one page, and then the next page is on the next page. So that gives evidence that this was a codex bound on one side, and the Christians seem to have really liked that, perhaps because this meant they could sort of, flip. Gee, what did Jesus say back there? Sort of flip back and forth, and maybe cross-reference some things. And so the codex caught on, especially among the Christians. Eventually, it's going to catch the rest of the world is going to catch on to. Maybe they were already using it, and we just haven't found any copies of other writings. I don't want to say it was only the Christians, but all of our earliest codices are Christian writings. And going all the way to the 4th century and 5th century AD, where we have some big codexes like the entire Old and New Testament, all written in Greek. These are all hand copied. They didn't have the printing press many hundred, more than 1,000 years later. These are all hand copied, but they are bound and preserved for us. Now let's talk about literacy. And one of the points we have to say about literacy is that there's a difference between reading and writing. Now, in our public and private education systems, these two usually go together. You learn to read and you learn to write basically at the same time. That wasn't the case among ancient peoples. There were people that knew how to read that did not necessarily know how to write because writing materials were so expensive. And so reading was considered one skill, writing was considered a different, yes, related, but it was considered a different skill. And there were plenty of people who could read that really did not develop the expertise of being able to write. In that regard, there was a profession that had developed, the profession of an amanuensis. Comes from the term manu is the Latin word for hand. And so an amanuensis is one who gives his hand or writes on behalf. That's the hand idea. He gives somebody else a hand in writing, who writes on behalf of another. And there is some evidence that the New Testament writers, like Paul, used perhaps the surfaces of an amanuensis. Oftentimes this would, in fact, more often than not, this would probably be a slave. I suppose somebody could do it for pay. You have in Romans chapter 16 and verse 22, this little note, I, Tertius is actually a slave name, I, Tertius, who write this letter, greet you in the Lord. Notice he's the one who's actually writing. Paul's dictating, and Tertius is writing. I like the little picture here where Paul is listening to the inspiration of the Lord who's speaking to him, and then he's passing it on to Tertius. I think that's a clever way to picture it. I'm not sure that it looked exactly like that, but Tertius then was doing the writing, And he inserts this little verse. I'm sure it was with Paul's permission, but he sends his own personal greeting where Paul has been giving his greeting throughout that chapter.